So the next element of the hydraulic system we'll look at are what are known as our conveyance lines. And conveyance lines typically within an aircraft are going to be a mix of different pipes, tubes, hoses, flexible lines, those kind of things. And some of the things as a technician to be aware of, we want to be careful of and pay attention to things, the routing of these, as well as like the support, how well they're supported. So what you can see here, when we route these lines, even hard lines, we got to be careful, that they aren't up against structure or something that could rub. Here they have a support bracket on the left side with little plastic or rubber or Teflon bushings inside of the holes that these tubes go through in order to prevent them. Now, these lines do often have to be able to move a little bit. They do flex, and they do sometimes when you put pressure on, they do sometimes move a bit. And so, by putting like Teflon pieces in here, these lines can have that little bit of motion without getting damaged by chafing on things. You can see these ones also have little labels on them, these little plastic labels. Like this one says, it says hydraulic line left gear, and then it shows an arrow pointing the direction of flow. And you can see in this picture above all these various lines that have labels on them, showing things like fluid flow direction and what components that they're ultimately going to. So older aircraft didn't have as much of that. Newer stuff, fortunately, manufacturers have gotten better about doing the whole labeling thing. So if you're replacing a line that has labels on it, often you can get the labels to replace them, and I highly recommend you do whenever possible to make life easier for the next person that has to work on it. So if we're looking at hard lines, these are majority of them are going to be made out of stainless steel. Stainless steel is very strong, it's corrosion resistant, it's puncture resistant, and heat and fire resistant. But it's not as lightweight as something like titanium, so there are cases where occasionally you'll see a titanium line, although that's pretty few and far between. These use AN flared fittings for connection, and I bring this up, it's called a 37-degree fitting. There are some industrial fittings that look very similar, but just know that they are a slightly different degree. I think some of them are like 40-degree fittings, or some of them are like 35-degree, and so they're close, they look similar, but they're not the same fittings. But what you get is these use a metal-on-metal seal. They don't rely on a rubber seal to do it. So that's what I've kind of sketched up on the board, and hopefully it's dark enough people can see. But I've got a line coming in from each side. One of them is flared out. The other one has a ferrule on the end of it. And you get this threaded body that pushes on the back or the left side of the flare here. And then you have a nut that goes around the ferrule side. And when you tighten these together, it's going to force this surface of the flare against the surface of the ferrule right here to create your seal. And there is you don't put any kind of sealant or O-ring or rubber piece in between. It is purely, you are tightening those with enough force that those metal surfaces create a fluid tight seal. That being the case, what is going to play a part in how well those seal? What are some things to keep in mind when you're working with these fittings? What's that? So how tightly you torque these together. Okay, if they're under torqued, what could happen? It'll leak. If they're over torqued, what can happen? It'll probably crack this flare, and then it'll leak as well. And then what does the next person do? No, what do they usually do? They try to tighten it even more. Like, oh, it's leaking, I gotta tighten it more and tighten it more. Maybe it works for a minute, but then the crack gets bigger and it leaks some more. So if you have one that's leaking, unless it's like obviously loose when you go to, double check that it's not cracked. What else when you're putting these together might be important since it's a metal on metal connection there? The cleanliness. It doesn't take much, between the sealing surface to cause the metal from touching to slightly separated. So you just want to, just make sure those are clean before you put them together, if at all possible. Okay, and whether that's going on to, this is a line to line with a ferrule, or sometimes you have an actual just like fitting, an AN fitting that it'll tighten down to, which is what's shown kind of screwed into the ends of these check valves right here, right? So these are various check valves on here. But these are, here's that nut, there's a ferrule under there, and then they go on to these AN fittings here if they don't have the ferrule attached to the line. Okay, for our flexible lines, these are going to be a synthetic rubber hose. What's important about our synthetic rubber hoses when we're talking hydraulic systems? Fluid, what kind of fluid are we using? Different rubbers, different synthetic rubbers are going to be compatible or not compatible with different hydraulic fluids. Okay, so you need to make sure your hose is appropriate for the fluid that you're using. Most larger transport aircraft use phosphate ester-based fluids. What's that more commonly known as? Skydrol. Skydrol is like the Kleenex of hydraulic fluids, right? Everyone calls a tissue a Kleenex, but Kleenex is actually a trademarked brand. Skydrol is a trademarked brand. It's trademarked of the DuPont company. But a lot of companies besides DuPont make phosphate ester-based fluids. Okay? And those are, phosphate ester, they are a synthetic fluid. Okay? What's the other fluid you may run into? More smaller aircraft typically. What's that? 5606. That's based on mil spec 5606. So that one's not a Kleenex Skydrol situation. That's a mil spec. And again, companies will have their own names for their 5606 fluid, but it will meet the mil 56-5606-H specification. Okay, and I do not remember the phosphate ester specification off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up. But you have a synthetic rubber hose. However, the hose itself, what's the hose there to do? Is it there to enclose the fluid, or is it there to resist pressure? Is a rubber hose good at withstanding 3,000 psi on its own? So that's not there to resist the pressure, it's there to encase the fluid. It's then going to be encased, or in the rubber will have embedded some kind of a braided jacketing, and that can be either a fabric type or metallic. So metallic braid, cotton, synthetic braid, or even oftentimes it's a combination of both, several different layers on top of each other of braided strengthening. Sometimes, again, it's embedded in the rubber. Usually there's some braided material embedded in the rubber, and then you've got even an outer jacket on top of that. Okay, it's a lot of pressure these are holding. But the biggest thing here when you're installing these, you want to make sure they're not going to be chafed or anything like that. But with hoses, typically hoses are going to what? What kind of components are going to have a hose running to them? Compared to a tube or a line. Things that move. And so when you're hooking up hoses, think about, you're hooking it up in, say, a hose going to a door actuator. Maybe you're hooking it up with the door open. What's going to happen when that door closes? Have you routed it in such a way that it's not going to get caught or that it's not going to chafe? Make sure you run things through their cycle, move them, make sure, everything is clear. The other thing you don't want to do, so that's the mechanical loads, you also want to make sure there's no twists in the hose. And so, the twist part. But the hoses will have then a AN, again, 37-degree fitting that will fit on the end. So this shows some different examples of hoses with kind of layers of jacketing and braiding. Here's some actual pictures of them. So here's one with a fabric outer braid, this black one. You can see the metallic outer braid. And then you see one where they've put a fire sleeve over top of it in the orange, right? And then on the end, here are the AN style fittings that are going to use that 37-degree. Here's the female fittings up top and a male AN fitting here at the right. You can see the 37-degree surface on each side of it there. And you're going to have the matching, female side of it inside of these B-nut, what are called B-nuts right here. Okay. When we're installing them, as I said, make sure that they don't put any, that your hose isn't being pulled tight, right? We don't want to pull the ends off of it. And then the other part is they're going to have a line down the side of them, or they're going to have hose information. Like they'll often have the mil spec or something will be printed along the side so that you can make sure that it's not getting twisted. Okay, you don't want to impart a twist in the hose. If you twist the hose far enough, what's it going to do? Now, if you twist the hose, what happens if you twist the hose? It's going to put a kink in it. Okay, that can at the low end of things, it can impede the flow of fluid. It also causes some folds to form, and those can create pinhole leaks. You know, if it's constantly twisting and untwisting, and it's folding the hose at the same spot, you'll get little pinhole leaks at kind of the corners of where you get a kink in the hose. So, okay. So, though they seem fairly simple, there's, you know, again, the biggest thing for you when you're looking at it, you know, what position is it in? Is it properly supported? Is there a chance something's going to chafe or rub? You know, and when something is able to move, is it something that could be damaged during the movement process? Again, working on them. Okay. So that's how we move our fluid around. In the case of the next component we're going to look at are called accumulators, and these are used for two purposes. So earlier I talked about an attenuator. That's kind of like a very small accumulator to smooth out pressure spikes. We can also use an accumulator to smooth out bigger pressure spikes or dips caused by the piston pump, but also by actuation. When you first start moving something, until the pump has an opportunity to kind of, for that swash plate to move and for the flow to ramp up, we can use an accumulator to, you know, help smooth that process out and to provide fluid. So an accumulator is designed to store hydraulic pressure. Okay, we store hydraulic pressure in an accumulator. It's almost like a battery for a hydraulic system. Or you can think of it as like a capacitor for a hydraulic system. Right? So you've all been familiar with like the inrush current on a motor, and you have a capacitor to prevent that. Yes? Nod yes or no? Hopefully I'm not. Yeah, hopefully you've been that far in electrical. If not, I'll use a different example. But the accumulator works in a similar way. So if the system, you know, you drop the landing gear, those big landing gear actuators start to move, fluid starts flowing really fast. The pump has to move this, you know, sense that and start to move the swash plate and ramp up the amount of flow. And if it can't, you know, because it can't do that instantly, an accumulator is going to shoot some fluid back into the system to help maintain that pressure, fluid under pressure in the system. So that's what the smoothing out the pressure does. The other part is we can use an accumulator, typically with some kind of a valve, or a check valve, or some kind of a manual valve, to store pressure for use when the hydraulic systems are off. And this can be for emergencies, it can be for ground use, and it can be for hydraulic initial bootstrapping if you have a hydraulically pressurized reservoir. Okay, if you have a bootstrap, you know, a piston type fluid pressurized hydraulic bootstrap reservoir. So what these are, you know, when hydraulic systems are off, the big example of that, who was out there when we put the air stairs up without having to pump it the other day? There's one group, I think. So if you've run on the 727, for instance, if you've run the hydraulic systems recently, there's an accumulator for the air stairs. And so instead of, when you go to close the air stairs, instead of having to manually pump them up, if that accumulator has pressure, it can use that pressure to push the stairs up into the closed position without having to manually pump it, even though the hydraulic system's off. So that's what, when systems are off, usually it's to operate things like doors, or it's used to maintain pressure on a parking brake, you know, that kind of thing. Emergencies, emergency braking if you lose hydraulics, or to provide some pressure to operate flight controls until your air-driven hydraulic pump is able to deploy and get spun up to speed. Right, so that's emergencies. And then initial bootstrapping is we can use an accumulator to hold pressure on that small piston when the hydraulic pump is off, so that when we first kick the hydraulic pump on, there's head pressure in the reservoir to get fluid moving to the pump. Okay, these come in two main types, a cylinder and piston, which is shown here on the right, and a diaphragm or bladder shown here on the left. Okay. So I'm going to start with the piston type. And here you can see a couple examples. And in front of me, I've got a couple examples right here. So here's one that's all put together. And essentially, I got to get it out there. What's it look like? Looks like a pipe bomb. I mean, that's basically what it is. It's a pipe with a cap on each end. Okay. But in the middle, there's a piston that can float back and forth or up and down. Okay. And so what you have is on one end, it says air end, or typically we use nitrogen. On the other end, it says fluid end. Okay. So the fluid end's hooked to your hydraulic system. The air end is like a balloon. We store air in it. So the way these work is we empty the fluid out. We make sure there's no fluid in, and we pressurize the air end. So I'm holding this one this way. We pressurize the air end with typically about half system pressure. So if we had a 3,000 psi system, the air end is usually pressurized to about 1,500 psi. If it's a main system one, maybe if it's like a parking brake one, sometimes it's less to give us a little more capacity, maybe 750 psi. But usually it's roughly half system pressure. And then what happens is when the hydraulic system comes on, fluid, the big key here is fluid does not flow through these. Fluid flows in and out, but it does not go through an accumulator. Okay, so when the pressure comes on, it comes into the fluid end and it pushes that piston up, making the airspace smaller, the gas area smaller, or volume smaller. Okay? And that fluid's coming in at, we'll say, most commonly 3,000 psi. It's going to push that piston up in this diagram to the point where the air goes from that initial charge of 1,500 psi to a matching 3,000 psi, right? And then once it's at that same pressure above and below the piston's not going to move any further, unless there's a drop in pressure in the system. If the system pressure drops below now 3,000 psi or whatever that gas has been compressed to, that gas is going to push the piston back down, and that's going to push fluid under pressure back out into the hydraulic system. Okay? So again, fluid does not flow through this. It flows in and back out again through the same port. And then you have air to charge. It's called pre-charge to charge the other end. So this one, you can take it apart. It actually has a sleeve on the inside of it. Okay? And the piston is stuck in there. Whoever was in class with me yesterday saw me trying to get it to move, and it was stuck pretty good. Used to move easier. I think I got to put a little bit of hydraulic fluid on there. Yeah, it'll move if you push it. But you guys can pass this one around. This one is clean inside, just to kind of see how it operates. Now the one on the screen there, it shows that little knobby bolt-looking thing in the middle. That when the piston's all the way down, it's going to plug this opening. This doesn't have that. You'll see this piston just as a piston. There is no check valve type thing on it, which is, it's fine. It doesn't matter. So that's one style. Here's another example of one. Okay, this one, they don't come off, but you can see it has a gas end and a fluid end. And again, there's a piston that goes back and forth. There's a reason we have this. I changed out a lot of these, probably about 100. This is a pipe bomb. So these were cracking at the cap and they were blowing the caps off. And like one on our plane, it would blow the cap off. It blew the cap off. It was aimed right at the elevator control cables. So those were like, that was like an emergency AD, like, hey, you need it. We just took them out of the plane and capped it off until we could get new ones. They're like, just get it out of there. I was working, the first airline I worked for, the plane had this style up in the nose. And one of the guys I was working with, we towed the plane outside. He removed the gear pin from the nose area, the nose gear. These were mounted up in the nose. And the people in the plane were going through the pre-flight. They turned on the hydraulics to run the brakes and everything. And it burst the accumulator. And the cap embedded itself. It came out the bottom of the plane and went about 6 inches into the pavement. The body of the accumulator went through the top of the nose of the plane and shot out into the airport. Right after, literally half a second after Scott had ducked out from the gear well. They were up in the gear well. So just to give you, I mean, I'm not trying to scare you, but I'm telling you, these things can be, hydraulics and the high pressures, they are high pressures. So yeah, don't be, but yeah, you'll see those style of accumulators, the long skinny one, they were cracking and they were all swapped out for an AD. So these are piston style ones. I do have some videos of them actuating that I will play real quick. So we looked at the bladder type one there, or the diaphragm or bladder type accumulator where it uses an airbag to push it in and out. Okay. Both of these you'll have, and the one I'm passing around has one of the charge ports. This is a high pressure Schrader valve. And that one I don't like. That one's actually not a super high pressure. It's got a coronet, but we'll see these. I didn't bring one. I've got one in hangar 4. This is instead of using a core to seal it, it uses this nut that you screw down to seal it. There's no core inside of there. If you take the cap off, it's just open in the middle. But the pre-charge is anywhere typically from 1/4, 1/3 to half system pressure. Okay, that's that nitrogen pre-charge, gas pre-charge. Make sure though, and this is a big important part, accumulator must be empty of fluid whenever you're checking that pressure, and even more so when you're charging the nitrogen. It wasn't uncommon for people to service our accumulators when they still had fluid in them, and then when the fluid dropped off, the pressure would be low again. They'd service them because the pressure's low. Well, when the pressure's low, it doesn't always push all the fluid out. So then when it pushed more of the fluid out, the pressure was low again. So you need to make sure you bleed down your accumulator fully bleed it down before you service it. Okay. Earlier we talked about hydraulic pumps. I mentioned how often, typically the case drain fluid, which is shown here in yellow, is going to, in this case, you can see it comes out of the pump and it comes down, it goes through a heat exchanger before going to the return circuit and back to a reservoir. You can see both pumps here go to this heat exchanger. So heat exchangers are used to remove excess heat from the system and typically are located between the pump case drain and the reservoir. Okay. Different types are fuel oil, so we can cool the hydraulic fluid by, one way is to heat the fluid or heat the fuel. So if you put these right up by the engine, you can use them to heat the fuel going to the engine, another type of fuel heater to prevent ice from clogging up things like filters in the fuel system, okay? Or what's more common with fuel oil is that the heat exchanger is located in the tank. So they basically run a bunch of hydraulic lines through the wings, through the wing tanks. And then as the fluid travels through those, it's just set up, it just goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth inside the wing tank and then goes back to the hydraulic system. It's going to dissipate heat to the fuel, right? The fuel in these tanks can be outside air temperature, -20 degrees Celsius, -40 degrees Celsius. The wings are out and exposed to that. The fuel is really cold. It's a great place to dump excess heat. Okay. But it also means that if you get a leak in them, you end up with hydraulic fluid in your fuel, which is what led to the demise of the engines on the 727 and the APU. Although we had this happen when I was at the airline. We would get leaks in these, and we were losing hydraulic fluid. We didn't know where it was going. We would send some fuel from the tanks out for lab checks, and they'd say, yep, there's a little bit of hydraulic fluid in there. We would have to empty the wing tanks. We would have to replace fix the leaks. The fuel that was in there would get pulled away and recycled, and they'd remove the contaminants from it before, putting it back into the national jet fuel system. But that's one way. Another way is air oil. So on some aircraft, it's like a radiator. The hydraulic fluid goes through a radiator-looking device. Air flows over it, and that cools the system. So one of the planes I worked on had 3 hydraulic systems. The number 1 system, which is primarily on the left side of the plane, left engine driven, its heat exchanger was in the left wing. And the number 2 system, its heat exchanger was in the right wing. And then it had a number 3 system. The number 3 system used ram air over a just over a radiator air, oil to air heat exchanger. And on the ground, there was a fan that would kick on if you needed to get airflow. And one of the things in the, in the manuals mentioned if you're running the #1 system or the #2 system, you had to make sure you had a certain amount of fuel in the tanks if you were going to run the systems on the ground to provide adequate cooling. If the fuel in the wing tanks was too low, you could potentially overheat the system if you ran it for too long because it required that fuel to be a heat sink. Okay, so different types. You can have, there's 3 main types. So tube type heat exchangers are basically just, this is the tube in the wing. You can see a bunch of hydraulic tubing run through a fuel tank in the wing. And fuel's used as the heat sink, and it's near the bottom, always submerged in fuel. Okay, but again, there has to be enough fuel in the tanks for it to be a good heat sink. And it is prone to, if you get a leak in it, contaminating fuel. That's pretty rare though. The reason it happens on this plane is because it sits so much and water condenses. Then, this is sitting at the bottom of the tank. So not only is it immersed in water or in fuel, but it's immersed in any water that's in the bottom of the tank, and that corrodes them. Okay, an operating aircraft like the ones I worked on, 7 years of sumping fuel off of airplanes every night, several airplanes every night. I never found water in our fuel. The United States fuel system, the system that supplies jet fuel, is very, very good and does a very good job of supplying clean fuel. So we really don't get the water issues. As long as where the water comes from is if a plane sits and moisture can condense inside the tanks and then it runs down the sides of the tanks into the bottom. But if a plane's being used regularly, you don't really see water as too much of an issue. A shell and tube type looks like this. So it's got an outer shell that has, in this, one of the fluids flows through the outer shell. That's shown, that would be these top 2 ports on the picture, the actual one here. And then there's tubes that run through the middle of it. So you have a cap on each end that distributes fluid through these various tubes that go from end to end. And so it allows the heat to transfer between the shell fluid and the tube fluid, or the tube fluid and the shell fluid. And so you could have, oil going through one. This would be used for like a fuel heater on an engine. In fact, this is how the fuel heater that you look at on the JT9 works, except it uses engine oil instead of hydraulic fluid. It uses warm engine oil, flows through the shell while the fuel flows through the tubes, and it heats the fuel. You can do the same thing with a hydraulic fluid. So run the fuel, through the tubes, run the hydraulic fluid through the shell, or vice versa. And then, it can go, either one can flow through either spot. You just don't want them to mix, obviously. And here's what an air-cooled one looks like. So, like I said, looks like a radiator. It's got either ram air or fan air that's going to flow through it. And fluid flows into one of these ports, goes through these various kind of flat tubes to the other side, flows back through the flat tubes in the lower half, comes out the other port, cooler than when it went in, hopefully. Okay. All of these things, all this flow, we need to be able to control where it goes. So we have various valves that are used in hydraulic systems. Okay. So we have flow control valves, okay, pressure control valves. We have servo valves, check valves. I've got a whole list here we'll go through, but flow control valves are things like on and off, rate of flow, direction, that kind of thing. Pressure control, we've already talked about one, the pressure compensator valve to be able to maintain system pressure. Things like check valves and snubbers, also known as orifice check valves. We want to be able to select things, sequence things, and priority is another type. It's another name. It's one, it just is how the valve is actuated, but they both sequence items. Flow equalizing. Fluid typically wants to take the path of least resistance. Sometimes we don't want it to take, but we want it to be equal flow, not all go where it's easier. I think of like a fuel injection system. If you got one injector where the fuel could flow to it really easily, that's where all the fuel is going to go. Hydraulic fuses. What's a fuse do? What? what is current? So you're used to fuses in the form of current. Current is what? Electrical flow, right? So what do you think a hydraulic fuse does? It stops. Yep, if your flow exceeds, it'll close it off. And then pressure control and regulators. So we'll start with the easy ones, check valves. You know what? We'll do valves later because I want to stop and talk about a couple things. So, and that's a good point to, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, we'll start with valves next time. Don't